Howdy, I'm Helgast. Welcome to the Disaster Report, a series looking at a franchise to see how it evolves to its current state, mainly looking at the development side of each title. This video tackles Parasite Eve, a franchise that I'm slowly getting into. My own experience with these games was my younger self watching the trailer of Parasite Eve 1 on those PS1 demo discs. I've slowly started to play through the first, but to my surprise this franchise started off as a book, so put on your lab coat and hide your mitochondria, as we're going into the Disaster Report. Parasite Eve was a novel debut for Howdy Senna, who at the time was a pharmacology graduate. It seems like Senna writes all of his works for himself mainly, but his writings were inspired by a few other authors like Dean Koontz, Richard's Matheson, William Goldman, and Richard Preston, with Dean Koontz being his biggest inspiration. Before I continue onwards about this, if you don't know much about the book, here are the quick notes on it. It's all about how the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell that can be modified to create the perfect life form. That also happens to be a parasite, go figure. It grows up and manipulates the main character to try to create the perfect life form. There was a lot more nuance to the novel, but that's the main gist of it. It wasn't written for a particular audience in mind, and instead would consist of a lot of science mumbo jumbo, along with a sociological discussion about the Japanese health system. So when the book became a smash success, it was a big surprise to Senna, especially when it became a bestseller. It would be so successful that Parasite Eve would be the first to win the Best Japan Horror Prize. No matter how hard I looked at what organization gave this award or other winners of this award, I couldn't find anything, and it doesn't help that Japan has a good number of award ceremonies for books. But this has to be an award only in Japan because the book would be a Japan exclusive for a while, taking years to get an English translation due to translating Japanese to English being really difficult, especially for horror or mystery novels as it's too easy to lose meaning with translation. The English version would finally come out in 2005, 10 years after the novel's release. The success brought a wave of adaptations. The first was the 1997 Japanese movie, made by a company named Katawa Shoten, which also happens to be the publisher of the book. Shoten is a big company with a plethora of smaller companies underneath them, including a manga publisher and a movie studio. However, Parasite Eve was a big deal for the studio, as this was the first movie to come out in the last 3 years. The studio's hiatus for movie making happened to the studio's president Harakiri Katawa leaving the studio because he got caught in a cocaine scandal. Now Shoten wasn't just any random movie studio from Japan. He is also recognized nowadays as one of the big directors that saved the Japanese film industry. Katawa's first motion picture was the 1976 The Iguamas, and it was their first big budget movie costing $4.2 million to make, which was big for Japan at the time. To give a little context, 1974's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla had a budget of $1.2 million. This is my only example because I'm not too familiar with older Japanese films besides the Godzillas and some of Akira Kurosawa's samurai movies. Katawa would produce about 60 films, all of which had big scale budgets, with them aiming for the mass audience appeal. A strategy that worked most of the time because by 1992, Katawa made 7 out of the top 20 highest box office grossing Japanese films. And such a great career like his would all come crumbling down after a cocaine scandal. So Parasite Eve was a big deal for the company being the first film without the original president. The first big difference with Parasite Eve compared to older Katawa films was a significantly smaller budget, with it being less than $1 million. If you want specifics, its budget was about $900,000 and had the same amount for marketing, so technically they spent about $1.8 million, but that's still a far cry from their older films. The studio hired Mizuki Okiai as director, who previously worked on shows like Tales of the Bizarre, If, Mashimo, and The Girl Who Left Through Time. Now I believe that he was only hired because he worked with Fuji TV, a Japanese media company that decided to co-produce the film, so to cut cost, would use the talents they already had like Okiai. They would also bring Ryoichi Kimazuka, who worked on the same project as Okiai. The two wanted to keep the horror that Parasite Eve had, but couldn't due to budget restrictions, and they were the producers that were forcing the movie to become more of a love story. Now, romance was in the novel, but these producers were pushing for it hard. I'm going on the assumption that this was another cost-saving measure. On the casting side of things, they got Ryona Hazuki, who is known for her TV roles, while her most notable role at the time was playing Hanasatu in Sharku. Due to the subject matter, Ochiai was concerned that fans would want to see Hazuki nude. He would take inspiration from mangakin Tasuka Azumu, who tended to draw women without their nipples. Now I couldn't find which manga he was referring to, because trying to find it just led to a lot of porn, which was not what I was looking for, I think. The only thing I have to go on about this is that he was talking about how the manga was about med-hating women who were set to take over the world. So if you happen to know what it is, let me know in the comments, because I'm actually curious to see what the fuck this guy was going on about. But going with a nipless look allowed them to shoot scenes that were still sexual without losing too much of that body horror themes the novel had, which somehow is the only noteworthy thing that the filmmakers would talk about for its entire development. It took 8 weeks to film and had a 5-week run through 150 Japanese theaters. Critics at the time would praise the directing style of Ochiya, and that was about all the praise. Most of the negatives that I've read just kind of boils down to the movie feeling like a big budget TV movie, like a big budgeted Lifetime film, which is not a compliment. It seems that it might have just broke even, and it could have done better if it didn't have such a limited release. It also didn't explode in DVD or VHS sales that other movies normally had, because by the time that these would start rolling out, Hideo Nakata's Ringo would come out and murder any chance that Parasite Eve might have had. But this small blunder was fine for the Shoten Company, as it had another adaptation with a Japanese company called Squaresoft, leading us to Squaresoft's PS1 game. To understand Parasite Eve's development, you have to understand that this was a different time era for Square Enix, as this predates the whole merge between Squaresoft and Enix. Plus, they were riding high on that Final Fantasy VII money. With FF7's success, they followed the same Square attitude for all their games, where the cost didn't matter when it came to making a good game. If you don't know much about Final Fantasy VII's development, they spent $21 million on just some supercomputers after leaving Nintendo. However, Square didn't want to be just known for making RPGs. They wanted to diversify their games. To start this off, they would get the rights to Parasite Eve so that the game could ride on the success of the novel and movie, just in case things didn't fully work out. The team knew right from the start that the story was not going to work in a game format. Instead, they would go with the sequel route. It was produced by Harunobu Saguchi, whose resume at the time was impressive, as he was the director of the Final Fantasy series, starting with 1 all the way up to 6. The director was Takasha Tokita, who isn't as big, but he directed Live Alive and Chrono Trigger. The story was created by Sakaguchi, who went out of his way to not watch the movie so that it didn't influence him. It started as a direct sequel with it being set in Tokyo, but Sakaguchi changed it to New York since he thought it was a more interesting setting. But to prevent this from turning into another RPG, they brought battle designer Yoshiko Makawi, who also worked on Final Fantasy VI as a field planner, and Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars as a director. He took advantage that Parasite Eve was being made on a modified Final Fantasy VII engine, allowing players to run around in real time to dodge and position themselves for attacks. Now keeping with true Squaresoft's fashion, they wouldn't be cheapening out on any of the CGI cutscenes. This would be the first project at Square to use both the American and Japanese teams. On the American side, they hired Steve Gray, who worked at Robert Abels and Associates, doing CGI works for projects like Tron and Star Trek 1. But he also worked at Rhythm and Hues, making CGI tools. He was located in the Hawaiian team, with the planning going smoothly, leading to the creation of the game's protagonist, Aya Bray. She was created by Sakaguchi, who got the original sketches and was disappointed with them, so he brought character designer Tetsuya Nomura on board to design her, with a handful of specifications, like to give her long hair similar to Aerith from Final Fantasy VII. However, due to the amount of projects that Nomura was working on, he was also in the process of designing a character with short hair. I have no idea what character this is, but it could have been someone from Irigai's Brave Fencer Mushia or Final Fantasy VIII. So he ended up mixing Aya and another character and combining the two hairstyles, leading to the character design we have now. Even though the design was different, Saguchi liked it. He liked how it showed Aya with strength with some fragility. But with it being the 90s, there was also an emphasis on Aya's sexiness. After all, the pinnacle of video game sexiness was Pyramid hit Lara Croft. The music was done by Yoko Shimura, who was notable for a lot of Capcom games. Her music was on Breath of Fire and Street Fighter II, but she also did some work on some Square games like Super Mario RPG and Live Alive. An impressive resume already, but Parasite Eve was her breakout project. When working on it, this was her hardest project because she didn't want the music to just be some basic ambience or techno music. So instead, she went full experimental, breaking away from her standard method of making music, create something inorganic while being a recognizable product of Square. To create something inorganic, she would take an emotionless approach, so she could best capture the atmosphere and Aya's stoic attitude. However, with this, the battle music took a lot more brainstorming. Since most of the soundscape uses opera music, that style of music doesn't really fit into battle music well. She was at a dead end for a while until the American staff took her to a nightclub. Hearing the background music in the club gave her inspiration for the battle music. The PlayStation was also the first system she worked with that had enough processing power to use vocals, something that she was excited for, and she would go out of her way to pick unknown vocalists. For this product, bring Shani Rigsby for Samina Memoralis, Judith Surla for the Influence of the Deep. And I'm not going to try to pronounce this next one, because I already have a hard enough time saying Japanese names. Fuck Latin. Parasite Eve would be released on March 29th, 1998, and it sold about 1 million copies, being the 6th top-selling game in Japan that year. It would re-release in America under the Greatest Hits label, which tended to come with a discount. By 2004, it's estimated that it sold about 2 million copies worldwide, with critics giving praise for its unique gameplay style and the graphics, whilst I would be critical of the RPG aspects, especially how its simplicity could hurt replayability, especially when you compare it to Final Fantasy 1997, which is not a fair comparison. But it was successful enough to be the console game of the year, action, and RPG of the year during the 3rd annual Interactive Achievement Awards. But it would win the hearts of critics and gamers, even winning over Hideo Senna, the original author, who gave his seal of approval, stating that he was impressed of how Square was able to translate the novel into a game. The success of Parasite Eve 1 greenlit a sequel. Before we talk about the sequel, we have a small pit stop to make. This is to talk about the manga, which came out before and after the game's launch. These were published by Shoten because the studio wanted to keep milking this cash cow with 3 mangas. The first coming out shortly after the novel's success, and it's pretty much the novel in manga format. Then during the launch of the game, there was a tie-in manga with a really long name that I'm not going to say, focusing on the characters that might not have died in the game. Now here is where limited information makes it sort of hard to tell what fully happened, as there are some conflicting reports on who worked on these, as a few would say it was written by Noriko Hazuki. Then there was more that said it was written by Fuji Noriko, and I'm going to stick that it was done by Fuji because there's more sources saying that it was him. And he's a mangakin that has little info and a smaller amount of works under his belt. His works include 1994's Dark Vermelon, the 3 Parasite Eve mangas, Resumeden E-Zone, and Shatori Shu. All of his works stayed in Japan, and I don't think we're ever going to see an English translation, but I am surprised that the Parasite Eve manga never got a small English release to tie in with the game. This finally brings us to Parasite Eve 2's development. Parasite Eve would be done at Squaresoft again, but with a different development team, as Parasite Eve 2 started off as a spin-off and take more inspiration from Resident Evil than make improvements from the first game. To really get that Resident Evil feel, the team in Osaka would consist of ex-Capcom employees, mainly members that worked on the original Resident Evil. The directing and storytelling went to Kenshi Iwo, the original scenario writer of Resident Evil. Iwo originally left Capcom to start learning about advertising since he believed that Resident Evil wasn't promoted well. So when he found out that Square was hiring, it was going to be a match in heaven due to their bigger marketing presence. The spin-off was going to focus on a new protagonist named Kyle, and with it being a spin-off, they went all in on the action. But at some point, it was decided to be turned into an official sequel, making Aya the protagonist and removing Kyle from the game. To celebrate this change, Square with EA and FirstLook.com announced a contest to find someone that looks like Aya Bray, something that I would chop off as a cute thing for a company to do, of having the dev team find a best cosplayer, but since it's the early 2000s, the mood's kind of ruined. All these articles talk and insist that only hotties are allowed, so if you're not a cute hottie, then get the fuck out of here. That was sort of the vibe that many of the articles kind of gave off, but the winner would get a few copies and a $500 shopping spree. I truly wonder if this is part of the marketing that Iwo would have taken and learned and would have brought to Resident Evil. Without the original team and the push for action, they did want to make some improvements compared to the first one. They wanted to make the game more cinematic, and one of the best ways for them to do that is to lower the amount of transitions between battle and exploration. Pretty much not having any loading screens once you get into battle, and the RPG elements were put in the background so they could really focus on that action. This can really be boiled down to the executives wanting their own Resident Evil, so instead of continuing and evolving the Parasite Eve formula, instead they just went and made a knockoff Resident Evil for the sequel, which is something the fans didn't really want. As for the game's music, it was composed by Naoshi Mizuta, another ex-Capcom employee who did some music on Street Fighter Alpha and the Underground Laboratory theme from Resident Evil 2. Now this section was just fascinating as Mizuta and his decisions and his influences only came from the scenario and the images to create the mood, and from the interview that I read, he just seems like a kind of guy that just feels for the right sound. As he didn't watch many films to not get influenced by music, he barely played games in general, so there was no musicians to influence him there, and with one of the songs, Ghost Town, which has a bit of an alternative rock sound, he would just flat out state that he didn't listen to alternative rock music at all. He just seems like the guy that just goes with the flow, and when he hears something that he likes, he has to play it. And today he's just part of Square Enix band, where he plays the bass with his fellow musicians. The game was released in Japan in 1999, and it only sold about 220,000 copies. While in America, its planned release date was September 12th, 2000, where they had to convince the public that the upcoming 5 PS1 games were still a good purchase, even though the PS2 was already out, to the point where they would say that these would complement the PS2. This might seem like a bit of overkill, but Square really wanted to make sure these games didn't fail because they were just on a last-gen console. So in Japan, the game was released as part of the Square Millennium Collection, which gave out special editions of games. The best equivalence I have for these is that they're the modern-day collector editions, but these versions only came out in Japan, while the American release was just a normal edition with no thrills, and it led to it selling about 1 million copies, which wasn't this massive success that the studio was looking for, leaving for the series to stay in this limbo state. Oh, and before we move on, if you're curious on who won the Aya lookalike contest, it was Yumiko Shaku, who would start her acting career shortly after with Princess Blade. After the mediocre success of Parasite Eve 2, the series has become dormant for 7 years. Within that time, a lot has changed for Squaresoft, from them opening a movie studio and releasing a Final Fantasy movie that lost $48 million, then closing the movie studio, scaring a potential merge with Enix due to Square starting to run out of cash, but with the success of Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts, leading them to have some record high profits, Square and Enix would actually merge into Square Enix, leaving the structure and upcoming project to change significantly. But when Tetsuya Nomura started to finish his work on Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, which happened to be around 2007, Nomura wanted to work on a new game using Aya Bray. An important note is that they didn't want to make this a full-blown sequel, and they fully stayed in the spin-off territory. This note is important to talk about now as it makes the story and the decisions that they made less head-scratchy. This new game was greenlit as an experiment to get more into the mobile space. The game was going to be on the Japanese cellular service known as the Freedom of Mobile Multimedia Access. To my understanding, this was just a 3G service provided by a mobile company named NTT Docomo. An interesting direction to take, considering that the iPhone would just go live that year. So the game wasn't being targeted for that platform. But I think the real reason the company wanted to get into this was because FOMO had over 40 million subscribers in 2007. Now, to highlight what I believe was going through the executives' heads, we're going to have to talk about the other system sales in Japan. Only Japan because this was originally going to be a Japan exclusive. Also, we're looking for precise numbers of it being in Japan and only in 2007. The numbers are a little off, so there's going to be a lot of estimating by me. But we're going to start with the PlayStation 3, which sold about 9.3 million units as of 2013. So let's be nice and estimate that it sold about 2 million units, while the Wii sold 7 million units. Then we have the saddest console sales-wise for Japan, with the Xbox 360 only selling 1.6 million copies throughout its entire lifespan in Japan. So again, let's be nice and say it sold about 500,000 units, while the DS sold 21 million units. All of these are dramatically less than the potential 40 million customers that they could get with FOMO, if you ignore all the problems with that logic. The team consisted of director Hajime Tabata, who was brought on because Nomura requested him, since the two worked well together on Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, while the game's art director was Aizuma Kamakurio, who was the art director on Final Fantasy XII and Final Fantasy XIII. The game's scenario director was Momoto Toriyama, who worked on Final Fantasy X and X2 and Final Fantasy XIII Revenant Wings. Finally, we had the writer Toshimutsu Takuchi, who worked on a lot of anime projects, from IK Tusen, Queen's Blade 1 and 2, and Ramen Fighter Miki, with Parasite Eve 3 being his first video game project. Now, I know I've been calling this Parasite Eve 3 every now and then, so let's address that name so there's no more confusion. Since its conception, the game was going to be a spin-off, and with it being Aya's third game appearance, leading with the third birthday title. So with the no shit info out of the way, let's talk about why a TV writer was brought on board. Tabata and Nomura saw the mobile platform was a way to have longer stories for a longer period of time, so they wanted to use the episodic format to give the game a more TV drama feel, which is why Tasamitsu was brought on board. He was tasked to make each episode be an hour or two long. Since it was about 7 years since the last game, the team found Aya a challenging character for this title, since they wanted the 7 years since the last game to be canon, making her be in her early 30s since the last game, an age that the team found interesting. As they didn't see many games that did that, so they wanted that to be a big point, except they were going to half-ass this aspect, because instead of aging Aya, they kept her in her 20-year-old appearance to keep her sexiness. And yeah, this game really wanted to push the sexiness of the character in a more schlocky way than all the others. Something that we're going to talk about because there's an entire mechanic tied around this idea. But besides her figure, they wanted to give her a lot of depth, especially by having the story revolve around her regaining something she lost. The game would stay in New York, with one of the bigger concepts shared by the team was a snowy New York in a bloodstained wedding dress, while having the enemies being a distorted creature of time known as the Twisted was conceived early on. Plus, the gameplay mechanic known as the Overdrive was talked about but not really shown off. And in this state, from the interviews, it seems like it was going to be more of a story element than a gameplay element. It also seems that the whole body changing aspect that's in the final game wasn't in this build yet, and I'm not too surprised, as the team was having a hard time adjusting to how small the phone screen was versus a handheld at the time. Again, keep in mind this was 2007, most people were running around with a flip phone and bricks and whatever else they had. Plus the iPhone would just come out, and even if it was being developed for that, the screen is still wicked small versus phones nowadays. The game itself was really ambitious for a mobile game of its time, but it was running into a lot of hiccups with development. But they wanted to do more, having an online aspect where you could interact with other players, you could build and customize your own character, then have the game be released on a bi-weekly format so it feels more like a TV drama. It was just too ambitious, and the last that would be heard of the mobile version was an unreleased beta in 2008. Instead of the beta, Square Enix would instead announce the game was moving on to the PSP. The change of platform caused for a lot of changes due to the extra power the system had. The first big change was the story was no longer going for a whole TV drama angle. Instead, they wanted to make a more mature game, leading for the old story to be scrapped. Instead of it being about Aya losing a thing, it was about Aya's comeback. The only thing that survived narratively wise from the previous game was the twisted and the overdrive mechanic. But the team was a bit aimless, and they were willing to show Aya in different ways. And I mean that in a literal sense, as they were going full force on Aya's sexiness. As this was one thing that I kept seeing in an interview about how the team outdid themselves with a new shower scene. A homage from the last game that they went all out for some fucking reason. Now I understand the scene is fan service, but it's a hidden scene that a chunk of players didn't realize how to get. They talked about this aspect a lot, and it's weird of how much they talked about it. But this wasn't the only aspect of fan service, as we're gonna talk about the clothing damage system, a mechanic the team was really proud about. Normally a mechanic like this could be used to give a touch of realism, where it can make a monster feel more dangerous. As you can see the damage that's actually happening to your character, it feels more plausible. Because if someone slashes you with a knife and you see your shirt get cut, it puts you more aware that something's happening versus every other game where someone slashes at you with a knife and you just do a damage animation. It can also highlight what kind of damage state that your character is in, but that wasn't the point for Third Birthday. But instead, the devs wanted this refined sexiness. Don't ask me what that means, I don't fucking know. But to Square, this refined sexiness is giving the player a dilemma of play the game normally or get hit to see more of Aya's body. That doesn't really feel refined if you ask me. In fact, it sounds more like a tagline to some hentai game than some action game. Not to mention that it didn't really seem like there was a lot put into it, even though they mentioned they put so much time and effort with it, because most of the models all look the same. Like, can you honestly tell the difference that these are two different outfits? I wouldn't be lingering on this as much if it didn't come up so often in interviews I read. Like, they were hyping this system up quite a bit. Something like this could have worked if it was done differently. My example for something like this done right is Arkham Asylum. So it's different in regards of how it's actually done, but in what it achieves is great, as it shows what fights you've overcame. Versus haha Aya wear maid outfit, haha Aya butt out. There was a limitation set that they could only show up to bikini's amounts of skin, except there's already a bikini outfit, so what's the fucking point? Also, swapping between different bodies doesn't have the outfit damage system for other characters, because who the hell would want to see half naked men, am I right? At least Tekken gets fan service, right? But at least there's a few neat ideas, like there's a lightning outfit from Final Fantasy 13, and from there you can see her crest curse thing, which is an actual neat detail. It's a mechanic that could have put so much more depth into things, like having it maybe be a limb-based clothing damage system. Like if an enemy hits your leg, for example, your pants rip. Because in this way, they can still have their weird and creepy idea of sexiness, while also informing the player of what they need to be doing to dodge attacks. Informing the player that certain enemies are going after the legs or their arms, specifically giving feedback on what they need to avoid. I know I stayed on this point for a while, but a lot of time was put into this mechanic, and if it was defined a bit more, I feel like it would have worked, but instead for them to try to defend this mechanic by saying it's realism for adults, but also this refined sexiness, it's something that should have been cut early on so that they could make better decisions in the gameplay department. Like they could maybe reevaluate making a shooter on a system that has one stick, which brings new challenges, not helping that the dev team didn't have much experience with shooters in general. The most they have was Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy VII, which is rather rough around the edges, but the team realized this and they needed help hiring Hexadrive, a studio that was made of ex-Capcom employees, especially members that worked on Lost Planet Extreme Condition. But to get past the whole one-stick problem, the game lost free aim and used a lock-on system. When running around, the D-pad would be used for some camera control, which isn't ideal, but it gets the job done for the system it's on. But with the overdrive system, it allows you to switch between characters, giving you another chance in combat if you fall down to 0 health. Plus, with it leaning more into action, the RPG aspects would be lowered again. The reason behind this comes from the idea the team had, where when the player loses their party in an RPG, it's a shock, and it can be disencouraging to the player to either experiment, or it gives the impression that they need to grind. An idea that players don't need in Third Birthday, since dying is part of the shooter experience, encouraging you to get better. Being on the PSP allowed them to really scale up everything they could do. In fact, they would design the game as if it was a PS3 game and then convert it into a PSP. Don't ask me why they didn't just make a PS3 game, I don't fucking know. But at least the music team had a better plan of what to do versus whatever the fucking train wreck this is. As Square Enix brought Yoko Shimura of Parasite Eve 1 onto this project, and she would also bring Misuto Suzuki and Tezuyoshi Sakito onto the project. Suzuki's profile includes V-Tennis, FF7 Remake, and of course, who could forget Schoolgirl Striker's animation channel, while Sakito worked on Gyromancer, Brave Fencer Musashi, and some music on The Last Remnant. Shimura's involvement goes back to when the Third Birthday was a mobile game, but couldn't fully work on it due to so many other games that she was working on, and when you consider between 2007 and 2010, she made music on 10 plus games, it's obvious she was a busy woman. The idea for the music was to remix the older games' music so that fans had similar themes to listen to, but overall they had a lot of freedom to do the soundtrack, except for the theme song, as Square managed to get Japanese rock band Superfly song Eyes on Me as their theme. The game was released on December 22nd, 2010 in Japan, with the company aiming to sell 500,000 copies. However, on its first week it sold 140,000 copies, and it's estimated to have sold 353,000 copies by the end of 2011. When the game launched in all regions, it sold overall 520,000 units, which is above their target but not enough to warrant a new game, with the reception being rather mixed. But the biggest factor to this game's failure just comes that it was a spin-off game from a franchise whose last entry was 10 years ago. It would have been safer to either reboot the series or make a proper sequel. This concludes the entire franchise, and as of 2023, it's still dead. And it's been 10 years since the Third Birthday. Sure, there are rumors of a series remaster, remake, or reboot, but until Square Enix actually officially says something, I'm not gonna believe it. After all, a lot of video game leaks tend to be terrible, like how Bloomberg insists that there's going to be a Nintendo Switch Pro for every single year. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, why not subscribe? Until next time, have a fantastic day.